Science has rendered death almost unnatural, while the business of undertaking has rendered a family's care for its own dead virtually unnecessary. But have they? Bringing death back home, ahead on Wide Angle. The arrival of life in the form of a baby is typically a highly anticipated event, one prepared for with great relish. And shelves of books written on the subject attest to that excitement. But what of life's other bracketing event, death? Most of us dread this eventuality, and relatively few books have been written to prepare those of us who remain for the challenging work of caring for our dead loved ones. Joining me today from her office in northern Vermont is Lisa Carlson, the author of 4 such books, including, most recently, Final Rites, Reclaiming the American Way of Death. She is also the founder and executive director of the Funeral Ethics Organization. Welcome to Wide Angle, Lisa.
Nice to be with you, Peter.
Thanks for joining me. I guess I'd like to start our conversation, if we can, just with a sense of where it is that we came from. Yeah, I think of necessity, it used to be that families and communities cared for their own dead. Yeah. When was it that death care became more something taken care of by professionals? And I guess the follow-up to that is, how did that alter our relationship with mortality?
Well, 2 events. Number 1, embalming was introduced at the time of the Civil War, and that allowed them to ship the fallen soldiers back home, rather than burying them where they fell.
Right.
Then Lincoln was embalmed and put on a train and traveled around the country, which popularized the concept of embalming.
Interesting.
Now, funeral directors discovered that they had been cabinet makers, coffin builders, but this new ability to embalm elevated them, and they purported to be protecting the public health, which is a crock. Embalming does no such thing whatsoever.
Okay. All right.
But they could raise their prices. Now, the other thing that happened at about the same time, people moved out of large homes and into apartments. And there simply wasn't room in an apartment to have much of a funeral.
Right.
So it really was convenient to have a funeral home in which to have the funeral.
Interesting. So if we're locating this shift at roughly the Civil War, we're talking about 5 generations, and in that span of time, death care has become the domain, really, of funeral homes. Yeah, to such an extent, I think, that viewers might be surprised to learn that caring for our own deceased loved one can actually be done legally in our own homes without the help of a funeral home. Yeah?
Yes, and we lost the common lore of what to do at a time of death in a matter of just 1 or 2 generations.
Right.
My effort now is to empower people to take back that right, because doing so is not only very loving, it's very therapeutic. And having something physical to do at a time of death takes away the sense of helplessness.
Right. And in fact, I'd like to go back, I guess, back to 1981. You then experienced and committed yourself to caring for your husband who had passed. Yeah?
Yes.
And I think at first it was a matter, it was largely a financial matter. Yeah?
Yes, if I had had money, I would have given away what turned out to be a meaningful experience.
Exactly that. And I think what I read in your book was that by the time that you drove up to the crematory, your money had become a secondary issue. Yeah?
Absolutely.
What happened in the interim? What sort of shifted in your mind about the process of caring for your dead husband?
Well, John committed suicide in the front seat of his pickup truck. He had a very serious stomach pain that they had not been able to diagnose. And the note he left was, "I can't stand the pain anymore."
Wow. Yeah.
And I, I, he was a first grade teacher. We had almost no money in the bank.
Yeah.
And I knew under the circumstances that there would be an autopsy. So they said, "What funeral home should we call?"
Right.
And I said, "Well, there won't be a funeral home." And I'm sure they thought I'd gone off my squash.
Right.
I said, "Take him for the autopsy and then bring his body back here."
Right.
And then I began to think about it, and I didn't know whether I would fall apart or not.
Sure.
So I went back up to the end of the driveway where they were just putting John's body into the hearse to take him for the autopsy. And I found that not only was I not going to fall apart, I was overwhelmed by this enormous need to stay close.
Interesting.
So I said, "Is there a service charge to put the body in your $60 box?" And the funeral director said no. I said, "Then put his body in the box when you get back and we will come and pick him up."
Okay.
And the town clerk met us that night. I asked the janitor from school, who was a dear friend of John's.
Right.
He had a pickup truck, and I asked if he would help me take John's body to the crematory, and he said it would be an honor.
Okay. All right.
Once we got to the crematory, I needed to see John's body again. So Rip got a screwdriver out from under the front seat of the pickup truck and took the lid off the top of the box.
Right.
And he looked dead.
Yeah.
His features were very pale and waxy.
Yeah.
And if he had been returned to a lifelike condition, I'm sure I would have bargained with God to wake him up.
Yeah. So
but that made it easier to let go.
Right. My heavens. So I'm gathering then that that was your first exposure to essentially caring for your own dead, that you didn't have any experience in your upbringing of caring for your family or close friends caring for their own dead?
No, one of the writers in my writers group had written this article on how to bury your own dead in Vermont. And she couldn't get it published, and so she brought it to writers group to see if we had any suggestions.
Right.
And it was kind of an historical look back. Hey, folks, this is what our great-grandparents did, and we can do it too.
Right.
So just 6 months before I needed it, I got that information.
Wow.
What paperwork was required, what permits were required.
Right.
And that was the only preparation I'd had.
Wow. So that was something of a bold move, I would think.
Yes, she wrote about the fact that I had done this now without a funeral director. This time, she got her article published. So for the next year, a week rarely went by without a letter or phone call from other people wanting to know what to do and how to do it.
Interesting.
I was so grateful that I had the information when I needed it.
Right.
That I went to, and Sally wasn't going to do any more with it.
Yeah.
I went to the state law library, and I figured if it was the same in every state, it was a magazine article. If it was different in every state, it might be a book.
Right.
And indeed, I found enough differences from one state to the next that I thought it ought to be a book.
Right.
And my family was scattered all over the country.
Yeah.
So that there was a need to know in Florida and Texas and Pennsylvania what the laws were.
So the book, Caring for Your Own Dead, was born. if you will.
Well, almost, but not quite.
Okay.
I did an outline and sample chapters
Right.
and sent it off to 26 different publishers, small, medium, and large.
Right.
And as my then 5-year-old daughter would say, coming back from the mailbox at the end of the driveway, another ejection, Mommy. And I got 26 ejections. And I was unbelievably fortunate enough to find Steve a year later.
Right.
And his mother died of AIDS in 1986.
Right. And that's actually where I'd like us to steer toward, if we could, Lisa. Simply because, you know, your family had provided care to her over the course of her decline.
Yes.
And then made the commitment to extend your care to her death care. Yeah. And I think because what I read sounded as if there was a relatively large family involvement in that, I was wondering if you could sort of paint us a picture of how that process worked. What were members of the family, what various tasks and roles were they engaged in the process of caring for your mother-in-law after she had passed?
Well, prior to her passing, they would take turns using vacation time to come to Vermont and spend time with her and to take care of her.
Okay.
When she died, 2 of her sons built a plain pine box. Then the 4 adult sons lifted her body into the box and drove to family country property, where they spent the afternoon and evening digging her grave by hand. And then a week later, we had a memorial gathering at the graveside. And that was delayed enough that it gave people all up and down the East Coast time to arrange to get there.
Good, good. Because you wanted, and we spoke a little bit certainly, because you wanted to share, and certainly people were giving you calls and writing you letters asking you to share your experience from this. You wrote first, I gather, in 1987, Caring for Your Own Dead was published. More recently, it's Final Rites that was published in 2011. And your goals for those books were very specific, and I'm going to read them, okay? It is, quote, to help consumers navigate around the barriers erected by the funeral industry and government agencies that are supposed to be regulating it, to reclaim the traditional rights of families to care for their own dead, to say goodbye in the best ways that they can without paying extortional fees for goods and services they neither need nor want. It sounds as if in that paragraph there are a couple of warnings. Yeah? One would be the barriers erected by the funeral industry. A second would be conceivably government agencies that are supposed to be regulating it. Could you say just a little bit more about the caveats that you address there?
Well, to some extent, the public have been willing victims. They'll shop around for a computer or a car. They don't tend to shop around for a funeral. They'll use a funeral home that the family used in the past, or the nearest funeral home, or the funeral home based on a religious or ethnic affiliation. So they've been kind of, as I said, willing victims.
Right.
There are too many funeral homes in almost every state for the death rate.
Right.
So the funeral homes are kind of fighting over dead bodies.
Right.
And when they say they're not making a lot of money, they're actually telling the truth. Every time a do-it-yourself family handles the death, it takes away from the mortgage payment for the funeral director.
Sure.
So they have a tendency to hide the low-cost caskets and show only the expensive caskets, that sort of thing.
Okay. And government, how does government either moderate or sort of exacerbate this problem?
Well, it was the consumer groups that got the Federal Trade Commission to pass the FTC funeral rule.
Uh-huh.
And that was in 1964, I think. And basically, the requirements of the funeral rule are that the funeral home must give a printed price list of all the prices. They have to give prices over the telephone. They can't require you to buy something you don't want. And they're not allowed to lie to you about the law.
Sure.
They can't tell you embalming is required if it's not.
Right.
So, unfortunately, the FTC has not been very vigorous in enforcing the funeral rule.
Okay.
And the consumer groups have found multiple violations among funeral homes.
Let's take a break there if we can, Lisa, and ask viewers to join us on the other side, where we'll discuss death care rules as they pertain specifically to Massachusetts. Welcome back to Wide Angle. I'm Peter Bermudes, speaking today with Lisa Carlson about how we might become more active participants in the death care of our loved ones. All right, Lisa. So let's shift our focus a little bit and sort of zero in on laws and regulations in Massachusetts that would affect viewers. We go back a little ways. 1905. There's a regulation that was issued by the Massachusetts Board of Registration in Embalming, so which hadn't been around very awfully long by that point, if it starts just after the Civil War. And the regulation reads, "No permits for burial shall be issued to any person not registered by the State Board of Registration in Embalming," effectively taking from families the authority and power to bury their own dead, right? If I get that correctly. Okay.
Right.
4 years later, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court rules that regulation is invalid, suggesting that it's unconstitutional to keep relatives or their friends from burying a loved one. So that 1905 rule is effectively overruled. However, it stays on the regulations, as I read in your book, Final Rights. It stays on the books for another 90 years until 1998. And I guess my questions are two. One is, why? And what happened to shift that up, to bring that regulation change to light and allow Massachusetts families to bury their own dead if they so choose?
It was my friend Byron Blanchard who was active in what was then called the Memorial Society. Now it's the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Eastern Massachusetts.
Okay.
And he was trained as an engineer, but had a mind like a steel trap and could have been a lawyer, I think. And when he discovered that the industry was trying to control something they had no right to control, he went to the Department of Health and convinced the Department of Health that indeed town clerks should be allowed to give a burial transit permit, disposition permit to families.
Right.
And he finally convinced the town clerk in Lexington to do so.
Just next door to Arlington. Yep.
Right. So that was the beginning of getting families, and it isn't a widespread practice.
Yep.
It's still only a few people who choose to do so.
Right.
But there are some home funeral guides in Massachusetts,
Okay.
women who will help walk families through the process.
Right.
And caring for your own dead needn't be an all or nothing proposition. If you would like a partial home funeral, if the person died at home, you can keep the body there have visitation there, and then perhaps call the funeral director to move the body to the crematory.
Okay.
So you could do it half and half.
Right. So let's see, Caring for Your Own Dead is this year celebrating its 30th anniversary. Yes?
Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Over that time, do you sense that we've made progress towards sort of reclaiming death as a more natural part of life?
Yeah, absolutely, we're making progress.
Yeah.
It will never be the right choice for everyone. Even when Byron Blanchard died, they used a friendly funeral director in Stoneham. So it was a little ironic that he opened up Massachusetts on the one hand for caring for your own dead. But there are times where we're very grateful. My mother died in Florida, and I had spent time with her during her illness. But I was grateful that I could tell the hospice people which funeral director to call when she died, because I wasn't there when she did die. So there are always different times where there will always be times where funeral directors are needed.
Sure, sure. You have sat in the executive director position of two specific organizations that certainly people interested in this issue and interested in learning more about it should know about. So I'll ask you for resources, organizations, websites where people can find out more and conceivably get help if they are in the position to need it.
Funeral Consumers Alliance, which has both a national office and about 100 smaller state offices. And indeed, there's a Funeral Consumers Alliance of Eastern Massachusetts.
Exactly that.
And very often, these groups have done a funeral price survey, which is something families don't do for themselves very often.
Sure.
So it's very helpful.
Okay.
Then and their website is funerals.org.
Okay.
Then the Funeral Ethics Organization, funeralethics.org.
Okay.
And one of the things that I've done is to take the information from my book and put up on the left-hand side of the home page will be a red click here for consumer rights. And there's state-specific funeral consumer rights pamphlets. And in fact, your Eastern Mass people have helped me update the Mass consumer rights, because $1,100 is available for indigents from the state.
Exactly. Yep.
And families they've now increased the amount that families may contribute. So as long as the total isn't more than $3,500, then you can collect the $1,100 from the state.
Okay.
And lastly, finalrights.org.
Okay.
And the reason I mention that as a separate website is that it has the med schools for every state, including the cost to the family, if anything. In Florida, for example, the family has to pay for embalming. And so in other states, there's no cost to the family.
Right.
And some med schools have an urgent need of body donors and others don't.
Okay. Is there anything else, Lisa, that we haven't spoken of today that you feel would be important for viewers to understand?
Probably the most important thing is to have the discussion as a family. My grandmother my own mother died when I was 13, so I was fairly close to my grandmother, and she was trying to talk to me about death and funerals.
Mm-hmm.
I said, "Oh, Grammy, you're not going to die," which of course is stupid.
Of course, but
Of course. And we never did have that conversation, and I still don't know what she wanted to tell me.
right,
How unfortunate that
yeah,
she didn't insist.
right,
It would be so important. It's probably the greatest gift. We teach our kids about money, politics, and maybe sex,
uh-huh,
but we do a terrible job
yeah,
teaching them about death, dying, and funerals.
right. Well, Lisa, I thank you for your time. Certainly, geez, we're talking 30 years now that you have committed yourself to making caring for your own dead an idea that people, however foreign it is to them, can engage with and think about and ponder what is appropriate for them and their families. I thank you for giving us that idea to engage with.
Well, I get high on empowering other people.
Very good.
Right after Caring for Your Own Dead came out, I got a letter or a phone call from a woman in Massachusetts
Mm-hmm.
who said I had given her back control over a critical life event,
Mm-hmm.
and that made a huge difference in her life,
Sure.
to know what her choices were.
Right.
So that really made me high. So it's rather than doing for people, empowering them is what gets me going.
There you go. Well, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Peter.
Absolutely. To offer our goodbye can be a painful admission, but it is as essential to our relationships as the hello that necessarily preceded. Death, in the same way, seems as vital to the human project as birth. Though complicated by grief, it nevertheless offers us an opportunity to embrace life in all its loss and joy, anguish and wonder. And though it may not suit everyone, the act of bringing our loved ones home and exploring matters both large and small within the embrace of a community strikes me as one of humanity's most moving and, yes, beautiful witnesses. Of course, your beliefs are likely different than mine and my guests. My hope for this conversation, then, is that it encourages you to explore them further. On behalf of Lisa Carlson, I'm Peter Bermudes. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Wide Angle.
Do you want one of my funeral jokes?
A funeral joke? Sure, let's hear it.
The old guy at the nursing home comes shuffling up the hall in his pajamas and a long face and gets to the nurse's station, and the nurse says, "What's the matter, George?" He said, "My penis died." There, she said, "Those things happen sometimes," and send him back to his room. A little while later, he comes shuffling back down the hall and his penis is hanging out. She said, "I thought you said your penis died." "It did," he said. "This is the viewing."